What's going on, guys? Max Settings here, and welcome back to another review. In today's review, we're going to be taking a look at the Tin Hifi P2 IEM. Now, before we get further into today's review, just a little disclaimer. This P2 was provided for review by Linsoul. Linsoul is an online audio retailer that carries a bunch of different brands, and they have quite a few exclusives on a lot of different brands. And they reached out to me and wanted to know if I wanted to review anything that they sell, and this was one of the things that I requested. So once again, big thanks to them for providing these for review. I will link their store in the description below. Now, the Tin Hifi P2 is the follow-up to the Tin P1, which was their first planar magnetic IEM, and now this is their second one. And I did review the P1 quite a while ago. I thought it was okay, but it was really nothing special to me, and now this is their successor. So today we will see what I think about them and see if I think they are an improvement upon the original. So starting off with specs, the Tin P2 is quite expensive, coming in at $370. That puts them, I believe, a full $200 more than their original little brother, the Tin P1. After that, they have a 32 ohm planar magnetic driver with a frequency response of 10 to 20,000 hertz, and they use the 2-pin QDC style connector, and that is all of the listed specs for the Tin P2. So let's go ahead and move into the build of the P2. So let's zoom you in here so you can see. So the P2 is a metal body overall with kind of like a curvature, almost kind of triangular shape in some ways. And the faceplate is some kind of just like metal thing. It almost feels like a nail file, like you can file your nails on it. That's pretty much what it feels like to me. You can see the QDC style connector, and then nozzle, which is not too long or anything. It's just kind of a little bit odd of a shape, but nothing too crazy. I don't think they're too wild looking or anything. I'd say they're decent looking IEM all in all. As for comfort, I found them pretty comfortable to me. They fit in my ears well. I think the shape of them is pretty decent. They stayed in, and yeah, nozzle's not too long. It's not too thick. It's a pretty small body overall that really doesn't really interact with too much in your inner ear. And yeah, I think they're a pretty comfortable IEM personally, but again, IEM comfort I would say is even more subjective than headphone comfort. But to me, I think they are fairly comfortable all in all. All right, so now as for included accessories, so the P2, you get this leather carrying case, just kind of the flap sticks in there like that. Blue, nice. Coming in like a nice box as well, nice presentation box with drawers. And then this is the cable you get with them. By default, it ends in a 2.5 millimeter, and it uses the QDC style like recessed 2-pin connector. Now, this 2.5 millimeter poses a problem. The cable itself is, I'd say, is actually pretty decent. It's a little stiff, but not terrible. I don't mind the stock cable, but the connector, like I said, poses a bit of a problem. If you have a player or something that uses 2.5 millimeter, then really, I guess there's nothing to worry about. But if you want to use 3.5 or 4.4 millimeter Pentacon, then you have to use one of these. So I've shown you the Dunu swap system and then the Moondrop version of it, where you just swap the connectors on the end of the cable. This is like the jankier way to do it, where you just start with a 2.5 millimeter balanced, and then you get a 2.5 millimeter balance to 3.5 millimeter thing, and then you just plug it in like that. And as you can see, the 4.4 has rolled off the table. But anyway, the problem with this is now you have this big long thing with a lot of leverage. And when you plug it into something, all of a sudden you have, 2 inches on a 2.5 millimeter jack, and this is most likely going to break. And it's also just not very comfortable, like if you have a player and you're putting it in your pocket or something like that. This is too long and very, very easy to break off. So this system I don't particularly like, and I don't particularly recommend it. I would probably just go ahead and replace the cable instead of using this connector swap system. Okay, so now let's talk power requirements real quick. Now, I usually skip over power requirements for IEMs because it's usually pretty irrelevant, but I want to talk about it with this. So one of the amps on my desk is a shit Asgard 3. Very, very powerful amplifier. It puts out something like 5 watts a channel or something like that. But it's a very, very powerful desktop grade headphone amplifier. I also recently reviewed the Abyss Diana-Fi, which is a very, very insensitive planar magnetic headphone that uses quite a bit of power. This IEM took more power on the Asgard 3 than the Diana-Fi. Let that sink in. This took more power than a 91 dB a milliwatt at 32 ohm planar magnetic headphone. I have no idea why this is so hard to drive. I have an Ibasso DX160 through the 4.4mm balanced output, can't power it. ES100 Mark II through the 2.5mm output, can't power it. This thing takes so much power. I have no idea why they made it this hard to drive. I think this is why they didn't list the sensitivity spec in the product details, because it's got to be something ridiculously low, like upper 80s or something like that. This is the hardest to drive IEM ever, and it's harder than I think any headphone I have here. I mean, it's not HE6, but it's way harder to drive than Diana-Fi, HD800, etc. It takes absurd power. And so now all of a sudden we're out here where you're going to need, an extremely powerful portable player to get these running. Phone, absolutely not. You're not going to run these off of an iPhone dongle or a Mizu dongle or anything like that. Like I said, DX160 balanced output, doesn't do it. You need something with a lot of power to power this IEM, which to me just kind of defeats the purpose. They almost now become a desktop IEM because you need a desktop grade amplifier in order to power them. So that is pretty weird. All right, so now let's move into the sound of the Tin P2. So starting off with the frequency response, the P2 is rather warm. It has, I would say, at 20 hertz, about a 6 to 7 dB lift there. Like your sub bass and mid bass region is elevated, I'd say about 6 or 7 dB above where I would say is flat. It's another one of those things where it's downward sloping. By the time you cross about 100 hertz, it starts sloping down, and it's pretty much flattens out by the time you hit about 1K. After that, your mids are a little bit recessed. They don't have enough pin gain, in my opinion. I think they're recessed, I'd say maybe 3 dB from where I would personally consider about a balanced mid-range. I think they're a little bit recessed. And then after that, your treble on these is very annoying. On my unit in particular, I hear a little bit of a peak at around 9 to 10K. It seems to be like there's a couple dB peak. But then the other thing with these is these have insane air. I often say that one of the distinguishing factors between a good and expensive IEM is how much air it has, but these go excessive. These have some of the most annoying above 10K air of any audio product I've ever heard. The upper treble on these is really tizzy and bright and grating. They just have insanely boosted above 10K air that is extremely annoying. And that is about it for the frequency response on the P2. So let's start off with detail. The P2 is definitely a step up in terms of resolving ability over the P1, but for $370, I don't think it is particularly resolving. I'd say for maybe like $200, it would be pretty good, but I don't find it up to par in terms of detail with the likes of like the Blessing 2 Dusk, which is a little bit cheaper, but in a fairly similar price category to this. As for dynamics, it's less blunted and a little bit less compressed than the P1 is. However, the transients are still a little bit blunted over. I think the attacks are a little bit dull to me. The P1 also was, but I think it's not quite as dulled over as the P1 was. As for staging, they have, I'd say, above average staging. They stage decently wide. Imaging is, I'd say, about average. Nothing particularly great in that regard. Timbre on them is not that great, fairly plasticky overall, and the air just makes the treble sound very, very grating and kind of off-putting. And I believe that is about it for everything on the sound of the P2. So now as for comparisons here and my final thoughts, the Tin P2 really is just too expensive. It's $370, which is like $200 more than the P1. So now we're at almost $400. Now we're playing with some of the bigger IEMs. The Blessing 2 Dusk, like I said, I think is going to be one of its biggest competitors. The Blessing 2 Dusk is way better tuned. The bass is better. I know people are like, well, planar bass, but no, the bass on this is a lot less resolving, a lot less textured compared to the Blessing 2 Dusk. I find the Blessing 2 Dusk also more resolving than this. This thing, if it was like $200, I could see it, maybe like $220 at best. But for $370, it doesn't have the technical performance to live up for its price. And then also, it's just too bright. It's extremely grating to listen to. The treble peak with the air, really, really grating to listen to. And I do not enjoy listening to these. These desperately need some sort of EQ in order to make them listenable, which then, of course, makes the problem of powering them even worse, because then you have to apply negative preamp, which means you're going to need even more power to power them. And to me, it just makes it, all in all, far too hard to recommend. The technicalities are not there. The tuning, they're way too grating to listen to, way too bright, and they're way too hard to power off anything. You can't power them off of most portable sources. So all in all, the P2, for its price point, really can't recommend. And like I said, they're more or less a desktop IEM because of how hard they are to drive. So I would say for the price, buy the Blessing 2 or Blessing 2 Dusk. The P2 really can't get my recommendation due to its middling technicalities and very off-putting tuning. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed the review. Once again, thanks to Linsoul for providing these for review. I will link these in the description below if you want to check them out. I will also link my Twitter, my contact email, and all other relevant information. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed the review. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye.